welcome to Technically Speaking, where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge, and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Antonia, and I'm joined by Laura to talk about radiation and whether films portray it accurately. So, Laura, you used to work with radiation, and you also had some thoughts based on a film you watched recently.
I did, yeah. So I used to work in a lab that had two different sources of radiation, and I've worked in the nuclear industry for quite a while, so I'm fairly familiar with radiation protection procedures. But probably last Christmas, I was watching Batman Dark Knight. Right near the start, they mentioned the use of irradiated bills, and I thought, huh? So it made me think about how it's portrayed and what those words mean.
Yes, and I don't remember that. I did watch the film, but that didn't stick in my memory. So, what do you think they were on about?
It sounded like it was a way of tracing where money had ended up because they were trying to track down some criminals essentially and figure out how they were selling drugs, where they were selling drugs, that sort of thing, and gathering information on them. So I think when they say irradiated, it was a way of tracing the bills using radiation. It's not quite what the word irradiated means though.
I'm imagining glowing green American dollar bills now.
That would in a way make more sense than the way they were using it in the film.
Yeah. If something was irradiated, what would that actually be?
That would literally mean you'd be exposing something to radiation, right? Which I used to do all the time. US bills are made of a combination of linen and cotton, I think. So if you were to expose that to radiation, you'd probably find that it would just end up being a bit discoloured and maybe a bit brittle. I used to irradiate paper all the time because it was a good way of marking my samples, and that would definitely come out looking very aged. So I guess it would do the same to the bills.
So, once the paper is irradiated, would it give off any radiation?
It's unlikely. It would depend on what you'd irradiated it with. So I tended to use gamma radiation, which is photons. It's similar to light, it's just higher energy. If you were to irradiate something with neutrons, they can make something radioactive if they get absorbed by the atoms that go into the nucleus, and then they would change whatever atom into a different isotope, which may be unstable, therefore may undergo radioactive decay. But I'm also not sure that's what Batman did.
Well, I'm also just thinking, just because they blasted something with radiation doesn't mean it then gives off radiation which you could then actually detect and follow someone with. Instead, you just have discoloured paper bills.
Yeah, which I guess you could detect using certain means like spectroscopy. But I don't think that's what Batman was doing when he held his little detector device that had a radiation hazard symbol on it. I assume he was using it like he'd use a Geiger counter. I may have read far too much into this and overanalyzed it a bit too much.
Yeah, and is it possible that it would be above the background radiation? Because then how much would it have to be for it to stand out against the buildings which have background radiation from stone?
It would depend on how you'd calibrated your sensor. So say he'd picked a particular isotope to smear across these bills and then fixed it to the bills in some way so people couldn't then become contaminated with it. That isotope will give off radiation with a particular energy, so we could have calibrated a sensor to look at just that, and it could be something that's not so common. So that's one way you could do it, and it can be quite sensitive when you do it that way. I would expect. It's not really exactly what I did in my field of work, but I can definitely see how that'd be possible. If this is a thing you would ever do in real life anyway.
Yeah, but it gives us a bit of a thought experiment of could we be using radiation to track things in the way like a GPS pings out a signal and then you pick up that signal, but it has to also be you have to have a detector. So what kind of Geiger counter could you have that could follow it presumably through streets of Gotham City on that kind of scale?
Oh, could you get anything that was that? I guess you could get something that was that sensitive. I'm not too sure how you do the logistics of it. So there is a way of detecting how nuclear reactors are operating from quite a long way away. And I can't remember any of the details of it. I think it's something to do with neutrinos, but I might be misremembering that. And that sort of thing is very sensitive from like kilometers away.
Wow.
But it's also very specific to a particular application. Whether it would work with something that's been irradiated or is carrying a radioactive isotope versus something that is undergoing fission and giving off a lot of energy, I don't know.
I'm also imagining is that going to be a big dish to pick up that? Is the bat symbol also where he's got his radioactive detector to then have some other communications to his little handheld device that's presumably telling him where everyone's going?
Maybe you could use something with scintillation counters, I guess. That can be quite sensitive. You'd still have to calibrate it though, and that's the tricky bit because you rightly said you want to detect things that are outside of normal background radiation. That's probably not so easy to do. I think you do need to do it case by case.
If Batman knew what radioisotope he's used, he presumably would also know the energies. So he could have it calibrated so it's kind of a paintball. He's made that paintball. He knows how to use it.
Yeah, he could do. And when I looked at what he was doing in the film, he was holding his detector really close. I thought, well, that's probably alpha radiation in that case. Told you I thought about this way too much. So you could use something like polonium 210 because it's got quite a long half-life as well, so it gives off radiation for quite a long time.
Aren't alpha particles quite easy to absorb as well? So if it got covered up, surely it would then be absorbed and then you've lost your sort of signal.
It would, yes. So the advantage is that because alpha radiation is blocked by your skin, you're unlikely to receive any sort of radiation damage from it, but you would have to hold his detector quite close to it, which is what he was doing in the film. That seemed to be his method of detection. He had to be in the room with the bills.
I'm very skeptical of this.
Yeah, I did a quick Google search. I don't need to get anything specific about how they actually trace bills, but apparently you just use some sort of dye that fluoresces under UV and a really efficient money counting device that can go through lots of bills really quickly and can see that dye. That's apparently quite a standard way and sounds much more feasible, unsurprisingly.
Yeah, but it doesn't exactly tell you live information. It's not like a GPS tracker. You would just know where they've spent the money
You would.
and if you can correlate where they've been.
Yeah, I get the impression from a bit of research that I did that lots of businesses may have money counting devices that can detect these sorts of things potentially. Or there's some sort of government police coordination to figure out these things. So they'd normally do it in a coordinated way, right? Similar to the way Batman was doing it with Commissioner Gordon. They'd know there might be some criminal activity here. So we'll focus on this area and we'll send out some bills that we can trace. So that bit of it, I suppose, made sense.
Okay.
From the little I know about how money tracing works.
Who knew that this is where your background in radiation would take you?
This is what happens when you just overanalyze films, though, and you think, oh, come on, you're not really representing that faithfully. Surely no one would use radiation to track bills because there are safer methods of doing it. You wouldn't expose people to an unnecessary dose, even if it were tiny.
Yeah, no, there are literally guidelines about that.
Yep.
But we have heard of using radioisotopes for actually tracing things, but just in different applications.
Yeah. So one of the first instances I heard about this was nearly 2 decades ago when I was a relatively fresh graduate in the nuclear industry. It sounds like it's actually quite a common method used in non-nuclear settings to trace things. So you're basically looking at a radiation signal passing through something. We were using it to measure the level in a vessel where we didn't have any other radiation sources around. Basically, you calibrate a sensor on the other side of this vessel for the amount of radiation when the vessel's empty. And as the signal drops off, you can figure out how full the vessel is. So it's a non-invasive way of knowing what your fill level is, essentially.
Ah, I was gonna say there are much more basic ways of checking the level in something, such as opening the top.
Yes, there are.
So yeah, now you're saying non-invasive. Makes a little more sense to do that.
Yeah, I guess it would be for industries where you wouldn't necessarily want to open the lid and stick your face in and have a look. Hazardous chemicals.
Yeah, there are. I can think of a few where it's like that, or it's just not feasible. Tanks can be very big, and to climb all the way up to the top, you've got to have a permit to work at height, got to have a permit to open it, and then got a permit to not fall into it.
Yeah, I'm thinking of more Batman-esque scenarios that would lead to supervillains now from falling into tanks. But how funny that you're using radiation as a safer mechanism than just going and having a look.
This is the challenge of explaining industry and scaling up things. I think this is a classic chemical engineer's problem of it makes sense in a lab, but it doesn't make sense when you have a whole production site based around this.
So, talking about scaling things up, there are some quite good examples of tracing things on a huge, almost like a geographic scale.
All right.
So there's an example dating back from probably about 40 years ago now of leak testing 140 kilometers of a crude oil pipeline in India, and they were accurate to 1 meter using bromine 82, which is a gamma emitter. They could detect the gamma from whatever distance away through whatever medium it had to pass through. I didn't see any details on where that pipeline was, presumably underground or undersea. But that is one very large engineering scale.
Especially if you don't have, pipe work is often hidden away. We don't like to see it. And also you get a bit more protection if it's not exposed. So yeah, finding a leak would be quite hard until it resurfaces.
Yeah, and if it's something that's similar to the medium that you're already in anyway, or it's really dilute, how would you know? There's also examples of seeing how things disperse in the environment as well. So things like measuring water discharges to rivers and canals. You can use technetium-99 to do that. It's another gamma emitter. It's a quite short half-life as well. So you can get quite good time resolution if you wanted to.
I also heard about using radioisotopes almost as a marker, so you know how far it's been sort of absorbed into the environment as well, because you could see if there's particular places where it's popped up more.
Yeah, so to see if like a particular substance concentrates somewhere and then try and figure out why that might be. Is that the example that you saw?
It was specific to fertilizer, so seeing the uptake of nitrogen, and they had nitrogen 15, so they can spot it.
I think there are probably lots of examples like that, and you don't tend to hear about them all that much, but they're definitely there. And I wonder if part of the reason you don't hear much about it is because people think that it will be sort of scary to think about the idea that crops or whatever else are absorbing radioactive material. But they do that anyway. There's radioactivity in the environment. Brazil nuts are a good example of this because those trees have this really big root structure that extends really far. They suck up a lot of potassium, so they end up sort of concentrating it. And there are naturally occurring radioactive isotopes of potassium.
But I've heard that of bananas as well. So some people say how much is an equivalent dose in bananas.
I have heard that's quite a common one, yeah.
Another place where we've heard about radioactivity is in medicine.
It's used in a variety of ways, isn't it? You can either use it to trace where things have gone in the body, or you can use the radiation to treat certain conditions like certain cancers or thyroid problems. And they normally attach it to some molecule that tends to go to a particular part of the body. So they could potentially use the same radioactive isotope for all of this and just add some chemistry to it. But it's carefully chosen so they understand how much radiation dose you're getting.
So it would be gamma radiation that we're using in order to be able to detect it outside the body. Otherwise, alpha is just going to be ionizing the internals of the person who's you're trying to treat. And would beta make it out of the body either?
It would
No.
depend where it was, but probably not. And you want the radiation to leave the body, right? Because if it comes to the end of its track in the body, it will probably do more damage.
It's a weighted risk, isn't it? You've kind of measured how useful it would be.
Yeah, and I think we've sort of briefly gone over, there are quite a lot of uses of radiation in engineering and in the body as a tracer and various other things. Not so much for money, though.
Yeah, going back to sort of how radiation is portrayed in films, you often do see that hazard symbol of radiation warning, and it kind of gives off a bit of a scary, fearsome impression of a radioactive area. I imagine that isn't how you'd see it since you've worked with it.
No, that's a good point. I tend to think the same thing when I watch films. They treat it like it's some really bad thing, and it's just something else to be understood and worked with. It's similar to, working with electricity, where you tend to get trained people to work with it, or crossing the road, you tend to be more cautious when you're about to cross a really busy road, right? And there are actual procedures that you follow to cross the road. Stop, look, and listen.
So thinking of procedures, in Star Trek, sometimes before they go into a high radiation area, they use what they call a hypospray to give them protection against radiation, or they take pills. Do you think there is such a thing that exists in the world?
It would depend on the environment that you're going to go into, the radiation dose, and potentially the isotopes that you're exposed to. For example, iodine is taken up by the thyroid and it concentrates there. So sometimes you might be given iodine tablets to take if there might be quite a lot of radioactive iodine in an environment. So the idea is that the pills would contain non-radioactive iodine, and that would go to the thyroid, and then that would mean there wouldn't effectively be enough space for the radioactive iodine to accumulate there. That's how I understand of it anyway.
So that's a very specific radioisotope.
Yeah, and that tends to be how it works for just like general radiation effects. I mean, essentially what happens is you get things being ionized in the body. So you could ionize water, and the body's 70% water. So you get all these different fragments of water flying around in your cells, and they could then interact with your DNA and cause the DNA to become damaged. But if you had something that radiation chemists call a scavenger that would preferentially interact with those water fragments, it would prevent it from interacting with your DNA and protect it. And I guess most people have heard of antioxidants.
I think for beauty, and I don't know if people really know what an antioxidant does.
No, something that prevents oxidative stress or damage to molecules in the body through oxidation. So it's a similar thing. It mops up some of these chemicals that may cause oxidative stress before they have that chemical interaction.
That makes sense.
So you hear there's a lot of it in things like green tea and apples and tomatoes. So potentially eating more of those things could help protect you from radiation, but it depends on the dose rate. If your body is being blasted with huge amounts of radiation, I don't think as much antioxidants or anything will do, unfortunately. So in some of the Star Trek episodes, it's just fantasy. Unfortunately, it would be nice.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
You'd have to almost get your body weight in antioxidants for it to be able to interact with it instead of you.
So you would have to not be there effectively. Yeah. The way you control that in the industry is, first of all, you figure out what the dose is, you figure out how long you can stay in a particular area, and then you figure out if you need extra shielding. So a lot of the work we do is through like big, thick concrete walls with meter-thick lead glass windows, so we can see what we're doing but not get much of a radiation dose. So that's a slightly more practical way of doing it. But I guess in Star Trek, where it was like emergency situations, needs must.
Yes, and I don't think that spray was atomized lead.
Because that's toxic in itself.
Yeah, but they might have different body chemistry at that point, and they may be resistive to lead.
In that case, wouldn't you just engineer the human body to be more radiation tolerant than it already is?
But what would be radiation tolerant as a human body?
Yeah, I guess it would be able to repair itself really quickly, which it does quite well anyway. There are loads of different repair mechanisms for fixing damaged DNA and whatever else. It'd just do it faster. Whether you can do it faster, because then you're getting down to how fast chemical reactions can occur. I don't know. I feel like we could do an entire episode on just this, though, and get very distracted by biochemistry. And I'm not a biochemist.
I am certainly not either. And it's been a while since I looked at chemical reaction engineering.
Yeah, maybe let's not go there.
Yeah.
But you mentioned using a spray, right? And that reminds me of another movie. Not injecting something into your body with a hypo spray, but in Die Hard 5, A Good Day to Die Hard, great name. They went into Chernobyl and they were wearing hazmat suits, and they said, oh, radiation is pooling in this area, but it's okay, we have a spray. And they sprayed something around the room and then took off their hazmat suits.
Okay. Could that been a spray full of your antioxidants? Wait, no, that's not how it works. No.
Wouldn't it have been funny if it did, though? I suspect they have been somewhat artful with the truth, because there is a spray that, as far as I'm aware, is used in Chernobyl.
Ah.
But what it does, it's inside the reactor building. There's a whole load of dust that may be radioactive, and it can get into the air and it can then settle on things, or it could maybe escape through fissures. I think this was before they put the new confinement arc over it a few years ago, but I might be misremembering this. But essentially, they just spray water into the air, and it makes that dust drop out of the air, so it makes it a bit less likely that you'll have a radiation in air incident.
Right.
That's it. There's still radiation there. It's just not radioactive particles flying around.
It's like when you're in a smoggy city, particularly like in summer, that seems to be more hazy, and then it rains, and then you're like, wow, the air is a lot clearer now. But if they were saying it was pooling, what do they mean? Was it radioactive water?
Yeah, I think when they said the radiation is pooling, yes, they meant the water that is made some of that radioactive particulate come out of the air and is now collecting in one place. I still would not take off my hazmat suit in that condition, though, because it just makes sense to leave it on just in case. To me, it seems like an unnecessary risk to take. You might still breathe it in. It's not like it's actually fixed to the ground.
And to me, what is a hazmat suit doing? Because it's probably not lead lined, even if it was lead lined. Oh my God. Could you imagine how you'd move around in there? It seems more like it's preventing the water coming into contact with their skin or their clothes and sticking to them, essentially.
Exactly, it stops you getting contaminated. I guess it would stop alpha and maybe beta radiation, but you're still going to get a radiation dose if there are gamma rays around there. So yeah, that hazmat suit's just stopping you from being contaminated.
Yeah, keep it on.
I would, unless you've got some monitoring equipment that says it's fine, take it off, that's been assessed by experts. Yeah, leave it on.
And did they?
No.
Did they have those people?
No, this is where I say they were very artful with the truth, which was kind of annoying to watch because they'd sort of made up something that was just a bit silly, just, I don't know, for a plot point. I get Die Hard 5 isn't meant to be particularly educational. And that's kind of the fun of the Die Hard films.
Yes.
But still, when it comes to radiation science, I just think, oh, please, it's so misconstrued anyway. Don't make it worse.
But in this sense, because they were so lax with safety, does that mean that actually radiation is low risk?
Well, in that particular made-up scenario, it was like they had this magical spray that just halted all radiation. Wouldn't that be great? That would make radiation safety work a lot easier. So, yeah, I guess they were sort of showing, oh, look, radiation's fine, just spray something over it, that's it, job done.
If that spray did exist, that would make your life way easier. Is there anything else that you would want in the world of radioactive protection?
For the work that I was doing, because it was so well controlled anyway, probably not. I think what I would like to see, though, is things like the media saying, oh, a radioactive waste dump.
Okay.
No one just dumps radioactive waste. It's all highly controlled.
I see.
And it will go into this like incredibly well engineered store that will keep it locked up far away from people for quite a long time. So I think I'd rather see more sort of a change in how it's portrayed in mass media and in pop culture, things like this, rather than a change to, some fundamental science. It would be very cool though if someone came up with some amazing science that said, yeah, people, it's now fine to handle this thing. This thing is definitely not scary.
So I was having a thought about what seems to be one of the only ways to prevent gamma rays is lead. And I just wondered, is there another material?
Water's actually pretty good at shielding, and so is concrete because it contains a lot of water. You just need quite a lot of it. Used fuel is stored in ponds of water for that reason.
I thought it was to also bring down the temperature as well.
It is, yeah, but it also acts as shielding, and so does the concrete around it as well. The best thing you can do is probably just to put more distance between yourself and gamma radiation as well. Depending on how strong the source is, it's quite a big distance.
Maybe distance and things in between.
Yeah, get behind a big building. It's a good idea. Go inside and shut all the windows.
Yeah.
See, there are loads of ways to be safe working with radiation, so it's fairly well known.
It's just you gotta stop, look and listen.
Exactly. Pay attention to what that sign really means. And follow procedures.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a certain amount of radiation your body can absorb. It's not going to cause any problems. So some radiation is fine. I'm not saying go out there and find some radioactive sources, though.
No, that's definitely not what we're advocating here.
No, don't take apart your smoke detector. That's got a radioactive source in. It's there for a reason. It helps detect the smoke.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's another helpful use of radiation. So this seems like a good place to leave it. I think we've covered a lot about the uses of radiation, what it can be used for, and what we think it might have been an exaggeration of the truth or just made up. Speak to you next time.
The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.